So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another mechanical video. In this video, I actually figured out a really cool way to remove broken off bolts that are down in a recessed hole. Now, the most common way to remove a broken bolt is to drill a hole in it and then use an extractor to get it out of there. I actually tried that for about an hour before attempting what I'm going to show you in this video. If the bolt that you're trying to remove is busted off flush or a little bit above, usually you can weld a nut right to the bolt itself and remove it that way. The biggest problem with this situation is this bolt was broken off an inch down inside a recessed hole. So the first broken off bolt that we removed using this method was about 1 inch in diameter, which made it a little easier to work with. The second one that I actually removed using this method was only about a 1/2 inch in diameter and made it a little bit more complicated, but it still worked. Now bear in mind, this is only my second time using this method to remove a broken off bolt. And every situation is different. It might not work for your situation. It's also kind of a last resort option because there is risk of possibly damaging the threads or having some other things go wrong if you do attempt this. But irregardless, if you got a broken off bolt and you can't get it out, you're down to a last resort anyways, and I'm going to show you how we did it. So let's get to it. So the first broken off bolt that we're going to remove is off of a D9 dozer, and it's actually on a back track idler where the cap screws go in to hold the shaft. Now right here you can see that I actually tried to drill this out and use an extractor to remove it, and I felt like I was going to break the extractor off in the bolt, so I stopped with that idea immediately, because if you've ever done that before, extractors are extremely hard and extremely hard to drill those out. So basically what we ended up doing is finding a piece of pipe that was the same outside diameter as the bolt. We put that inside the hole and welded the inside of that tube to the broken off bolt. Now the cool thing about this method is if you've got threads, which this one did not, it was pretty much busted off flush with where the threads started. But if you've got a bunch of threads above where it's broken off, the piece of pipe you choose, if it's a little bit smaller than the threads, as you push that up against the broken off bolt and try and weld it, that pipe is protecting the threads from damage. Now, we did have some messed up threads right at the beginning, and I actually took my die grinder and shaved those out because I didn't want the risk of a damaged thread binding up when I'm trying to get that bolt out of there and possibly then break off our pipe to the bolt. We also tapered the outside of the pipe a little bit before placing it in the hole, just to help make sure that we were not going to bind up on the end of the pipe as we were trying to loosen it off either. Now obviously this isn't foolproof. Like for example, if the bolt is broken off at an angle, you might still have a gap because you can't push that piece of pipe all the way flush against the entire part of that broken off bolt. But you could always taper the piece of pipe to hopefully contour it in the same manner that the bolt is broken off. The other thing that is very critical if you're going to try and do this is to make sure you're as centered as possible welding that pipe to the broken off bolt. Because obviously as you try and twist it out, if it's off to an angle, you're going to fight the recessed area as you're trying to remove it. So you can see here that we were a little bit off as far as being centered on that bolt. It's kicked out to the side a little bit. What we did to try and prevent this is actually tack weld the outside of the pipe to the dozer, but we only did it in one spot. Looking back, I should have done a tack on each side of it, 180 degrees off from each other to hold it straight while we welded the inside. The other thing that's a little bit tricky to this is getting down where you need to start welding without arcing out on the side of the pipe while you try and get down there. So what we did to help with this is he was ready with the stick down inside the pipe, and I hooked up the ground so that way he was down all the way to the bolt, so it started arcing on the bolt immediately instead of it trying to arc out on the side while he's trying to get down in there. We also put the welder super hot so we got as much penetration on the tip of that broken off bolt as possible as soon as it started arcing. So we got that all welded up. Right here I'm just removing the tack that I put on the outside to hold it centered, and I do think we should have put a tack weld 180 degrees off from each other because I do think it pulled to the one side a little bit as we welded. We let it cool for about 5 minutes so it wasn't going to immediately break on us. Right here I got my pipe wrench on it and I'm working it back and forth. At this point I wasn't sure whether I was sticking to the side of the threads or the side of the housing versus pulling the actual bolt. So then I decided to grab some PB Blaster and quench it. I figured doing this was actually lubricating where we were trying to get it out and quenching it at the same time, and that actually worked pretty well. I worked it back and forth, and eventually it started breaking free. And right here is the end result. I'm gonna let you listen to it because we were a little bit excited when it worked.
Don't touch it.
Ah! Fucking go! Oh! Woo! So here's the end result of that hole. There was a little slag down inside, but not much, and nothing that was gonna prevent that bolt from going back in. So at this point we were 1 for 1, and we decided to try it on something else. So we had this big excavator that a bolt was busted off, recessed in a pin about 2 inches in. My biggest concern with this one was it was a much smaller bolt, only like a 1/2 inch in diameter. So we had to use a much smaller pipe, and I didn't know if we were gonna get enough weld inside that pipe to the head of the bolt to keep it from snapping off. Again, he put the stick down inside the tube, and I set the ground on, so he immediately started arcing as soon as I put the ground on. Now, when we first tried to loosen this one off, it actually broke pretty immediately on us. There was 2 reasons that did that. One is we barely tacked it in there, and the other is we didn't wait long enough for that weld to cool down and have more holding power. So after a couple times of having the stick actually stick on us while we were trying to arc it and get it started, and going back and forth with that, we actually had a good weld put on that, and we were able to break that free, and it did come out. To quench it down this time, I had some diluted dish soap in a squirt bottle, and I used that instead of PB Blaster, which has some lubricating properties in it, and I don't think that worked as well, so I would definitely quench it with a PB Blaster or something with some lubrication to it. I was actually really surprised with how much leverage I was able to put on that piece of pipe. I was expecting it to snap because the threads of this bolt that was busted off in there were pretty messed up, and that's why I'm guessing it broke. I actually had to fight that bolt, getting it out of there the whole way. Usually with a broken off bolt, once you initially break it free, it goes pretty easy. That was not the case on this bolt. And the end result of getting this one out wasn't nearly as exciting, so I'm not going to make you listen to that. Now, since the threads were kind of messed up on the end of that bolt, I did have to figure out a way to clean those up, and because they were recessed down in there so far, I actually had to weld a piece of pipe and a nut on the end of a tap so I could reach down deep enough to clean those threads. Once we did that, I was able to put both bolts back in that cap and tighten them down. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.